Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this webinar to launch and showcase AIDR's new Emergency Planning Handbook. My name is Amanda Leck, and I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. It is my pleasure to host this webinar this afternoon. The Emergency Planning Handbook is AIDR's latest published offering in the Australian Disaster Resilience Handbook collection. It is my pleasure to launch this handbook today, and I'm delighted to announce that the handbook is now live and freely available to download from the AIDR Knowledge Hub. You can see the link to the handbook on the slide here. Emergency planning plays an important role in the development of Australia's disaster resilience capability. The new handbook replaces the 2004 manual and reflects key changes across the emergency management and disaster resilience landscape over the past 15 years. Today, we have three guest speakers who will unpack the national principles and guidance presented in this handbook. I will introduce our speakers shortly, but first, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. Here in Melbourne, where I'm based, it is the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all join us from today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. Before we get started, a few items of housekeeping. Today you will see our presenters as well as their slides on the screen. You will be muted for the duration of the webinar. A significant component of this webinar today is dedicated to Q&A, so we ask that you please use the Q&A box to pose your questions, and we will address these following the speaker presentations. Please feel free to use the chat function for general comments, and I saw a number of you were putting where you were from in the chat box, and that's a great thing to see. Please make sure that you select all panelists and attendees in the chat window so that everyone can view your messages during the webinar. We've had more than 400 people registered to participate in this webinar, so we ask for your patience if there are any issues today. And please note that we are recording this webinar and it will be uploaded to the Knowledge Hub for you to view again later today or to share with your colleagues. Today, we are very fortunate to have three speakers presenting. We have David Parsons from Crisis Management Australia, Helen Foster, the Chief Risk and Resilience Officer at the Bureau of Meteorology, and Kirsten Tanner, the newly appointed Emergency Management Coordinator at Macedon Ranges Shire Council here in Victoria. We are very grateful to have them presenting today, and I'd also like to acknowledge the significant role David and Kirsten played in the development of the handbook along with the working group. So before we get started, we're going to do a quick poll. We'd like to know what sector you are from for those of us joining us here today. So you should be able to see a poll on your screen. If you'd like to put your sector in, or put other if we haven't listed the sector that you're from. We'll just give you a couple of moments. Okay, a couple more minutes or seconds. Okay, so we're going to close the poll. And we should be able to see the results of that up on the screen shortly. Okay, so a number of you are joining us from the emergency management sector. That's about a third of all people represented. And also we have close to 40% of people from government agencies, either state, territory or local government or Commonwealth government. And then we also have some people with us from the private sector, the not-for-profit sector, academia, and a few joining us internationally. So welcome everyone, and thank you for your participation today. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, David Parsons from Crisis Management Australia. And David was in fact the writer of this handbook. David has a long list of accomplishments, including being an adjunct lecturer at Charles Sturt University and a visiting fellow with the Joint Centre for Disaster Research at Massey University. I think David is well known to many people who will have joined us here today. He previously managed Sydney Water's Emergency Management and Counter-Terrorism Program, and we were very grateful to have David involved as the writer of this handbook. So over to you, David.
Thank you very much. I just need to firstly thank the great team who worked on this project. They brought valuable knowledge and wise guidance. So although I might have written the document, there's a huge amount of knowledge from a wide range of people in that team. A little bit about the handbook. This new emergency planning handbook replaces a much older handbook that was written in 2004. Now, 2004 handbook is very much focused on local government response planning. So the new handbook took a much broader view of emergency management across all the spectrum of prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery, and a much broader view on the entities that would undertake planning. Next slide, please. It recognised that the world's changed quite a lot since 2004, that there's now a strong focus on the actual prevention mitigation about the reduction of risk, that we now understand that the recovery of a disaster is very complex and takes a long period of time, and much more knowledge is being gained in that space. That resilience is now a thing that we focus on, both in terms of communities, individuals, and then organisations. We also recognised in writing this that we now talk about a shared responsibility from government to community and from the individual homeowner or else the individual business owner. That really emergency planning is a whole of society effort. The public sector, the private sector, NGOs, and philanthropic organisations, just to name a few. We also recognise, though, that in terms of emergency management, there are groups we don't know about yet, that who will form and emerge during a disaster. And these groups have a key role to play, and planning needs to think about that. We also recognised in this handbook that we now understand that disasters can be catastrophic, they can cascade and be concurrent disasters, as we're now experiencing here in Australia and across the world. We've recognised that there's been a strong shift from the 70s and 80s, where we probably had a fairly simple view of things, to now where we understand how complex disasters and society are, and that quite chaotic events can take place. And last of all, we recognised in this handbook that lessons management is now in its own right a skill set to be brought into the planning process. Lessons that are gained during an event, after an event, and learning from others. So these are some of the changes between the 2004 handbook and the 2020 that we've tried to actually build in. Next slide, please. The new emergency planning handbook takes an all hazards approach that's been written so they can be applied to any hazard or for any purpose. And as I said before, we've very much focused on planning occurs in terms of prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. And that's been an emphasis throughout the new handbook. We also in the handbook recognise that disasters can be very large and can be catastrophic, cascade, and be concurrently occurring, as the two photos on the right-hand side show just from recent weeks. And that the new challenge for planners, and the handbook, we'll talk about this in the last slide, is planning for uncertainty. A world that we now understand is far less certain than we might have thought of 20 years ago. And what does that mean for the planning process? I'll talk about that towards the end. Next slide, please. One of the things we did in the new handbook was move away from using words such as agency, because when you say the word agency, people tend to think of government agencies. So we've used the word entities to represent all formal and non-formal groups, government agencies, business, community organisations, people like the response and recovery, the rapid relief team, disaster, the Relief Australia, Blaze Aid, Wires, the Mindrew Foundation, so many different groups now that have a role to play in the disaster management space. And really emphasising that planning is a shared responsibility across all those players, that all players need to undertake planning and that those plans need to mesh in some way, and that's a real challenge. And we're also really did focus on in this document that planning needs to recognise the new participants in the game. They're not going away, and there's more coming all the time, as can be seen in the photographs above. Next slide, please. There was 7 core principles that we identified underpin good emergency planning. First one of those was that good emergency planning is risk informed. It's based on some sort of risk study. Now we fully realised in the emergency planning handbook that some people that would be a very large study and some that could be quite small. But we said it's very important that people think about what the consequences are, the ripples of those consequences, understand the community that are going to be impacted by the event, whether it's an organisational community or a community where people live. That there's needs to be some thought before planning's launched to understand risks and consequences, understand the client base. Reducing unknowns. It was our thoughts that you never really understand everything. There's always going to be things you don't know, but you can try and reduce those unknowns by understanding the risk, understand the consequences, understand the community and their attitudes, how they're going to respond, how they're going to adapt, how they're going to be more or less resilient after an event, and to look at the options available to you. So that is part of that planning process, reducing unknowns, trying to move towards more known information. The next third point was about being collaborative and inclusive. This is about planning with people, not planning to do things to people, but planning with them through consultation and engagement. And you'll find consultation and engagement mentioned dozens of times throughout the handbook. We talked about being strategic. That is, what's the objectives? What's the goals to be met? Who's the relationships we need to form? And what's the networks that need to be built? That good planning builds relationships, builds networks, and clarifies goals for people to actually achieve. Solutions orientated. This is about getting agreement where possible to the approaches to be taken, the risks and consequences, getting people to think through what the solutions are, because they'll be different by community to different times in the future. That planning is iterative. We're learning all the time. We learn from every step more about the community that we're serving, more about the hazards that we're facing, and more about possible options to solve problems or to mitigate risk. That dot point number 6, it builds adaptive capacity. It actually enables adaptation, doesn't squash adaptation. And certainly in a world of great uncertainty, which we're moving into, we have been now for a number of years, it creates a base to bounce off, to actually adapt off. Planning's not the end, it builds a capability to move forward. Shared responsibility. And again, good planning builds team actions, not individual actions. But it's important, of course, that those people that are part of that team have to be engaged and be consulted with and actually understand what we'd like them to do. And they'll have done that through the input that they'll have given throughout the process. Next slide, please. Another major shift in this version is we've clearly highlighted that good planning is running a project, that good project management skills are required for good planning outcomes. That is, we need to have a project sponsor and the authority clear. We need to have a project manager to run the project and a project plan that sets out timelines, resource needs, outputs. That the project team, those who are helping on the planning process, need to know what the responsibilities they carry are and what our expectations are of them on the planning committee, that they're there to deliver outcomes and to contribute to those outcomes, to review and to provide input. And they should be reporting on that project to key stakeholders. And so part of that project management, of course, is to identify those key stakeholders and to communicate with them and to report to them and liaise with them. Next slide, please. So we've put inside a planning flowchart. And really, if you go down the central part of the flowchart on the left or right-hand sides, you'll see boxes you'll see in the risk standard and other documents about consultation and communication and about monitoring and review. I think the key parts in the vertical column is we've added there that a document should be prepared, a plan, but it should be trialled and then endorsed. It should be tested in some way. And this doesn't mean a full exercise, of course, but it could mean some workshops just to test that what we've written meets the need and people understand, and it will actually work, not just be a theoretical document, but some good thinking about will it actually apply, will it actually work with the players that have to take part on the day. Emphasising the second bottom box, that good planning includes implementing the plan, which is about running exercises and training and building capacity and building capability. And last of all, lessons management. That is learning before we start, right at the top, because surely before you write a plan, you do research, and it could be reading lessons from other disasters of that type, to learning throughout the process, to learning at the end through debriefs and after action reviews, and fitting that back into the planning process. Next slide, please. What we've been very careful to do is to keep the emergency planning manual lean. That is not covering material at great depth that's covered in other national handbooks. So, for example, when we talk about community recovery, we say a small amount and then say refer to the community recovery handbook, which has lots of detail. In relation to exercises, there'll be a short comment about exercises, and then it refers to the managing exercises handbook. So we've done that throughout to try and avoid replication of those excellent products where subject matter experts have built those over time. So why duplicate that? We just reference back to them. Next slide, please. On this last slide, I want to talk about a challenge that we threw to the writing team, and we did put a section in the handbook on planning for uncertainty. And I certainly believe this will be a real challenge for the next writing team who take it to the next generation of thought in 4 or 5 years' time. I think the world will be even more clear in its mind that the uncertainty levels going forward are high. So here we're talking about a world that's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So how do you plan for that? What we've said is planning for that sort of environment is going to have to be strategic level planning that sets principles but doesn't go into great detail. That identifies the specialists we'll need to work with in complex events and identifies that actually that's going to be done through collaboration, so collaborative networks and relationships will be a key part of local and global players. Who has the information that we need and who can help build a solution. Flexible leadership structures where people come and go and join in a true teaming arrangement to solve problems at points in time during an event. Innovation, where actually the answer won't be in the plan. It'll set out the strategy, it'll set out the key principles, but we'll be building innovative solutions during an event. And so how are we going to do that? How are we going to make that happen? And the last one is building true learning organizations, which means in those complex events we've never seen before, with lots of uncertainty and lots of complexity that are novel, yet we're going to need lots of trialing of solutions. They're going to fail sometimes. We have to learn rapidly and correct actions and move forward and trial and fail and learn rapidly again. So I see this as being the big challenge for the next edition. We stepped into this space and we've provided some guidance, and there'll certainly be a challenge for the team in the future. So I just once again really like to thank those who worked on the project, a really talented team. It was great to work with you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you again for taking on the role of writer. We were really fortunate to have David's expertise. He has a lot of practical expertise in this area, as well as being a lecturer in the area of emergency planning. So we're very grateful, David, for your expertise. I'd now like to introduce Helen Foster, the Chief Risk and Resilience Officer with the Bureau of Meteorology. Her role incorporates risk management, compliance and protective security, in addition to resilience activities, including crisis management, business continuity and incident management. Helen was actively involved in the Attorney General's Trusted Information Sharing Network and is a working group convener on the International Standards Organisation Technical Committee, Risk Management and the Standards Australia Risk Management Committee. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you, Amanda, for the introduction. And I'm really pleased to be here today to present a case study on emergency planning. And many thanks also to David and to Ada for this opportunity. Next slide, please. As you can see, I'm going to be presenting a case study on emergency planning from the water sector group, which is part of the TISM, which you saw in David's bio. So the TISM is the Trusted Information Sharing Network, and it is the Australian Government's primary engagement mechanism for business and industry partnerships. And the partnership is with respect to critical infrastructure and managing critical infrastructure in the face of all hazards. The water sector, which is what I'm focusing on today, is one of 9 groups under the TISM. I've chosen the water sector's mutual aid guidelines as a case study for today, and I've chosen those guidelines to demonstrate the fact that emergency planning and an emergency plan doesn't always apply to an organisation, a state or territory, can apply to any number of jurisdictions and actually any number of countries, as will be demonstrated in the case study. Next slide, please. This slide actually indicates for you the facts about how we went through the development of the mutual aid guidelines, and what I've done is link them to the principles within the emergency management handbook, the emergency planning handbook. So as you can see on the right hand side, the principles that David has just run through are now linked to the processes that we went through in developing the mutual aid guidelines. For example, the section 1.4 applied to our strategic process and the planning that we were undertaking for the guidelines was a strategic planning item. We also talked about the reduction of risk. Our main objective in developing the mutual aid guidelines was for risk reduction for the corporations that were involved in major emergency events. We also provided the risk-based and adaptive solution to the problem of being able to continue water supply and wastewater supply services during an emergency to communities that may have been impacted. And we actually looked at planning, development, and we shared the lessons learned. So they were based on the guidelines as they were developed in the first instance were based on the collective knowledge and the lessons learned through emergencies. And these were the lessons learned by the water corporations, the risk managers, and the emergency managers. Next slide, please. So this is basically how we looked at the risks. So according to 31,000, for those that aren't risk advocates, don't live and breathe risk, the definition of risk is the impact, the effect of uncertainty on objectives, and those the impacts can be positive or negative, but really it's how they are impacting your objectives is what really matters. So section 2.1.4, I just check, is the area where that talks about a risk study. So these guidelines that we produced were based on a risk study on managing the risks associated with delivery of services. And the risks were relating to product contamination, which is a big issue for the water industry, supply chain disruption, and the impact of disasters, both natural and man-made disasters. The product contamination risks were linked to unsafe water and the ineffective wastewater services that may have arisen as a result of an emergency. It's important for water corporation to continue the provision of clean water, not only because there are legislative and regulatory guidelines for that, but also it's the general public or anyone requires at least 20 litres of clean drinking water for cooking and for washing each day. And so that's one of the focuses during an emergency, to make sure the delivery of that water is made and is reaching the people that it needs to reach. The other thing is, if we have issues with wastewater services, there's a public health issue. Before we had the guidelines in place, the control measures that were instigated by water corporations included using contractors to deliver services when they were overwhelmed in an emergency, or to use their closest neighbouring corporation. By introducing the guidelines, we spread that load, and it was about water corporations assisting other corporations with whatever resources they could provide, and with the logistics of getting those supplies and the resources to them. That was one of the issues that we had to face. We then looked at reviewing and monitoring the guidelines, and they were subsequently updated a couple of years after they were introduced to include agreements and other legal requirements. Next slide, please. So basically, the guidelines helped water corporations to restore services. And even though we weren't able to do that in all situations, we weren't able to look at our guidelines to help corporations, we certainly did in some. Basically, when we went through and tested the guidelines before release, we understood that we would have trouble with understanding what we had to offer. We also understood that we would have issues with logistics and getting the resources to where they were needed and getting them there quickly enough. And the other thing was to get water corporations to understand that the mutual aid guidelines were there to support them, and to get the right people to understand that. Next slide, please. The guidelines were communicated. If we had our time again, I think we would have a formal communication plan. We did a lot of discussion, we did a lot of workshopping on the guidelines. What we probably needed to do was to actually hit the right people that made the decisions on whether to activate mutual aid. And that became one of the things that we looked to our industry peak body to assist us with, because that's where the CEOs and the MDs actually got their information in some cases. So even though we didn't have that linkage and we didn't have that communication to the right level, we were able to use the guidelines in some really big events They started off with Black Saturday, where there were people, equipment, logistics and administration provided for over a 2 to 3 month period to help the affected communities. The Queensland floods, plant and equipment travelling from all different states making their way up to Queensland to assist, and there's also specialist services that were provided for a long period of time around insurance, etc. Cyclone Yessi, the same equipment applied, and Victorian floods where technical specialists and equipment were relocated for a period of months. And then Christchurch, after the earthquake, there were a lot of plant and equipment transported across to New Zealand by Australian water corporations to assist with the restoration of the wastewater system over there. And in fact, also the mutual aid guidelines were activated again in 2020 during what is now termed to be Black Summer. Next slide, please. So it's important to make sure that the plans, when they're in place, are tested and that they are reviewed and monitored. We actually had the mutual aid guidelines reviewed by APEC and AusAid, and they found that the guidelines provided benefits for the water corporations, such as the ability to restore services significantly faster than you would without the assistance, clear and concise and objective advice from water industry specialists, and access to a larger pool of staff to help with restoration. As you can see, 2020 is a testing time for anyone, including those with emergency plans, and it just shows us that, you know, preparation can fall short sometimes because we know it's sometimes not accurate. Our risk assessment aren't accurate, and I draw a conclusion from the World Economic Forum report. Their risk landscape had a risk on it, including the rapid and massive spread of infectious disease as a risk. They highlighted that in 2019 for the 2020 report, and it was a low likelihood risk, but they did indicate it would have a high impact should it materialise. And it did materialise, and it just reinforces that managing low likelihood and high consequence risks are required in developing our emergency plans. And I thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Helen, and thanks for providing such a practical example of emergency planning for the water sector. We had a webinar last week with some business leaders, and I asked them the question, had they included pandemics in their risk management plans, and none of them had. So yeah. I think your last comments are quite relevant. You know, what are we actually planning for? What does the risk assessment look like? And I'm sure you will have more to say about that during the Q&A. So I will now go to Kirsten Tanner, who is the Emergency Management Coordinator for Macedon Ranges Shire Council. And I know we have many local government officers joining us today. Kirsten has a Bachelor of Emergency Management from Charles Sturt University and has worked in various roles across government for about 20 years. Her passion for emergency management focuses on building resilience as a way to improve recovery outcomes, advocating for community-led recovery and gaining a deep understanding of consequence through before, during and after events. So welcome, Kirsten.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And I just want to thank everyone for coming today. I thank AIDR for having the opportunity to be on the working group, and a shout out to some of the working group members. I saw Russell Dippy and Justin Domlop join us today as well. So before I just start, I just want to make a disclaimer here that I am no longer an employee of the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions, but you'll see in the handbook that when I was on the working group, that's who I was speaking on behalf of. And I guess I joined Macedon Ranges Shire Council, in particular that council, because of their reputation for inclusive emergency planning. And they've done a lot of work around the inclusion of children and young people into the planning process. So I'm going to talk about 3 areas of interest that I was keen to see reflected in the handbook, and they really are just related to many of the conversations I've had and my experience of emergency planning. So on the next slide, please. So as I said, when I was working on the working group, I was with Regional Development Victoria, which is the statutory authority within DJPR. So front of mind for me were businesses. There are specific resources and representatives at various levels for critical infrastructure and specific resources for the agricultural and tourism industries. However, there's a gap around small businesses. We knew that small businesses often don't have insurance that is going to cover them for their losses. And this includes the indirect impacts on businesses where a road closure or unsafe environment means that their customers are just not around. We also had the beginnings of an economic recovery framework where the importance of the connection between social and economic recovery was backed up by the evidence that we had. And also just a recent example, it was quite obvious that there hadn't been any engagement with the business community or how small businesses might be engaged in recovery to understand impact and consequence. So they were really front of mind for me, and which is why I think the principle of shared responsibility and what that actually means and what that looks like is really important. So particularly from a government perspective, or a local government perspective, just stating that everyone has a responsibility for a resilient community is not helpful if we don't provide space for businesses to understand risk, what assistance may be available and what is their responsibility as a business owner. And then even going one step further is how businesses may assist in the recovery of their community when we're talking about locally led recovery, because there will be capacity and capabilities there that we can tap into. In my mind, you can't have a process of emergency planning where we espouse the concept of shared responsibility and then we do not make it collaborative and inclusive. For me, these two principles go hand in hand. Next slide, please. I guess another thing is that I've had the privilege of being on the state consequence team for a little while, and I was involved in a number of discussions where we worked through some really wicked problems. This gave me, I guess, the language to describe a systems thinking approach to emergency management. So kind of anyone out there that's new to this space, definitely have a look into consequence management and what Victoria is doing in this area. And again, during events, we had examples where there'd been really no or very little direct damage or destruction of businesses. However, we knew that there was indirect consequences to the local economy, and our current systems didn't have the ability to capture this information because it's often a story and it takes time for the hard statistics like the dollar amount to be known. And in order to get some government support in the first instance, we really need to have, they're after some hard stats, but often we've got a story to tell. So a recent example is the fires over summer in Victoria, East Gippsland and in the Hume area, where tourism was impacted throughout a much larger footprint than the actual fire because of the smoke in the environment. And a focus on consequences and documenting these consequences means that there was a greater understanding of what was happening and who needs to be engaged for the recovery discussion. And obviously, there's a great example, unfortunately, playing out right now where we've got compounding issues that require management and support, much broader than the health impacts of coronavirus. It's in mental health, the interruptions we've seen to the supply chain and all the work that's going on around to support that. So the social unrest, we've had some demonstrations in Victoria in particularly, and then the access to non-urgent health services, which has started up again, which is really great. The next slide, please. For me, this is pretty self-explanatory, and if I remember correctly, the working group didn't debate this idea at all, and you'll find a diagram in the handbook that's got local planning sitting at the top and kind of moving into the state plan. So they all do need to be integrated. But I guess I was really happy to see that the local plan sitting at the top of that. And we have a great body of evidence now around the importance of locally led approaches. And, it goes everything from understanding the risk. You'll get details from community members when you're talking about risks that you may not have been aware of. Again, the impact and consequences of an event, ensuring a clear understanding of responsibility, what might happen in response, and how to identify and provide the opportunity for emerging leaders in recovery. So these were some of the drivers and discussions that the working group had whilst developing the handbook. And I hope this has been useful, and I'm sure you'll find this tool a really good addition to the resources used for your planning. And thank you again to Ada and David.
Thanks very much, Kirsten, and thank you to all our speakers. We've had a few questions started to come through now in the Q&A box, but before we get started, and so that we have some sense of the level of experience that's on this webinar today, we're going to put up another poll just to see if you can indicate where you see yourselves with regard to your experience in emergency planning. I'm anticipating we might have a broad range of experience on the call, but it would be good to get a sense of that for our panelists as they move into the Q&A. So give you a couple of minutes. So when it comes to emergency planning, I'm fairly new but keen to learn more. I have some experience or knowledge. I've quite a lot of experience or knowledge. I'm mainly here because it sounded relevant and interesting. So a few more seconds if you could indicate in the poll where you see yourselves. Okay, we'll close the poll now and we'll get the results of that up on the screen. Okay, so the vast majority on the call, nearly 40%, have some experience or knowledge, and another close to 40% would say that they have quite a lot of experience. So there's obviously a lot of experience out there in this field, which is great to hear. We're now going to bring all the panelists back online and keep those questions coming if you would. And we'll go into the Q&A session. And just a reminder that this whole webinar is being recorded. If you have to go early, we will be sending you out an email when it's available online. Okay, so I'll go to the first question. The concept of community involvement in emergency management planning has been around for a long time. That whole notion of working with community, not doing something to them. And I think a couple of our speakers spoke about this. But this is something we don't necessarily do well. And I know it's something that came up with regard to the community engagement handbook as well. So how can we do this better and get significant community buy-in? And I think I will go to you first to answer this, Kirsten.
Yeah, sure. So from a local government perspective, I've been involved in a number of exercises, and this is a great way to get community involved in emergency and what might happen. So I guess the easiest thing to do is practice opening a relief centre, and you can go to your local school, local community, organisations, and ask whether they want to be involved. And the most recent examples that I have is the City of Yarra, and also at Banyule we did one. So that's a great way to get community involved in the whole and start the conversation.
Thanks, Kirsten. David, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, look, I think that one of the challenges for us is that if you're an emergency planner, you're probably a person who's got good capabilities in terms of intellectual capability, you've probably got a good job, there's a whole pile of things, you work for a government agency, possibly, and you'll be working with a community. The community is far more diverse than that. And I think there is a challenge for us, and I've been doing this for 43 years and I still haven't worked it out, but there's a challenge for us in recognise that the word community is quite a dangerous word, because it tends to make us think there's this big homogenous group, when in fact the community is made up of a vast number of sub-communities. And I think it's about identifying the leaders of those sub-communities and maybe working through them. And, you know, in our modern community, there's people who, for example, don't want to talk to people that wear uniforms. So if you're a uniformed person doing community planning, the uniform can actually be a block to you. In the emergency management field, we have so much language that's not common to the average person. You know, we have all this jargon that we've created. So it can be very difficult for the community to know what we're saying at times too. So I think it really is about taking a good amount of time to understand the community, who the leaders are within the community, and not necessarily working with every person in the community, but working with those leaders of those segments of the community to understand the way they perceive things, to understand the way they perceive risk, understand how they want to work with you when there's an emergency. So I think part of the challenge is us adapting to understanding the client base.
And just on that, David, I might make a bit of a plug for the Community Engagement Handbook and Companion Tool. Provide a framework to do just as you've described, to be able to work through a deliberative process of making sure that you're being inclusive and, you know, what your approaches might be. So I'm sure someone sitting in the background will put up a link to those documents as well. Look, I'm going to go to this question because it was one of the ones that came in first. And it was about this notion of, you know, what hazards are we in fact planning for? Someone asked if drought was in scope, given that I think it was a picture you used, David. Is drought now nationally recognised for emergency planning purposes? And they're saying they don't believe it is in Victoria. Who would like to take that? Perhaps either David or Helen.
I'm happy to jump in to start there. Is that the reason I put that photograph in was that a couple of things about the handbook. Handbook was written for emergency management planning on a very broad scale. So not just things that the government might think is emergency management, could be a corporation thinks it's an emergency problem. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that look at the drought response in Australia the last year, 2 or 3 in some areas. All the different groups that have had a role to play and have done planning. So there's all of the recovery planning. So there's lots of work being done. I know up here in my own state in terms of the resilience planning within a range of departments, working with farmers and rural communities. I put in the photograph, there was the rapid relief team. They're just one organisation out of so many that have provided massive support to farming communities and to rural communities. So all those organisations have a role doing planning for the hazards they want to plan for. So certainly the planning handbook isn't written for government pure emergency planning. It's for anyone who wants to undertake emergency planning to support their communities, whether it be a community where people live or a community where people work.
Thanks, David. And Helen, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with David. It is very contextual. So it depends on what your plan is being designed for. And you can't have one plan that fits another. From a water perspective, you're planning for drought by making sure that you've got adequate water supplies. And that becomes one of the risks that you're planning for. If you're in agriculture, you're planning for something different. So it's basically your plan, your emergency plan has to be contextual and based on the risks that your organisation or your area or jurisdiction is facing. And there is a lot of work done nationally on drought, as David indicated as well. And those drought management plans go right through from planning through to providing recovery, response and recovery.
Thanks, Helen. Now, I knew we'd get some questions around this, given we are in the midst of a global pandemic, but it is that notion of how do we plan for, events that might be low in probability, but, very high consequence, as we're seeing now with COVID. So how do we ensure that our risk assessment takes that into consideration and factors that into the emergency plan? Who would like to start me off?
Oh, I don't mind. Helen, do you want to go first? I'm happy to go first.
I'll go first.
Right.
So I'm sure quite a few organisations went to that shelf and dusted off the pandemic plan that was used for avian influenza back in the day and found that it didn't even match anything that we needed to do for COVID-19. The thing is, on your risk radar, whatever that is, and I spoke about the risk landscape that the World Economic Forum produces, that's your environmental scan. You should be doing an environmental scan for your risk process every year or every 18 months of which you pick up these outliers, and that was an outlier, but it was on the map and it was low likelihood, high impact. Now, the respondents that provide the information for that landscape did identify it, and they did identify natural hazards and bushfires, etc., and extreme weather events. So they were pretty much spot on, but it's got to be on your landscape. It's got to be on your radar for you to have something in place, planning-wise, to address it. You may have to rework it if it does eventuate, as COVID did this year. I'm sure the pandemic plans all look a lot different now, and the response plans that you have to develop to manage the COVID process are all being redrafted, and now it's into the recovery phase. But yes, it has to be there for you to have some idea of how to plan for it.
Thanks, Helen. And the speaker last week made the point that they didn't have COVID in their plan, but they certainly had bushfire. And so they were able to transfer a lot of what they'd learned about planning for bushfire to the COVID environment. But I think, David, you wanted to follow up on that?
So a couple of points about that is that, and you've made the key point there, which is principles. Principles can be reapplied, detail often can't. So part of the challenge is that no organisations also have limited cash and limited senior management focus, and so they're going to focus on the things that are burning them in the short term, and that will always be the case. But the challenge is that low frequency, high consequence events, of which there are many possibilities, maybe it's about building the capabilities for those events, and those capabilities are not about detailed plans. Those capabilities are about networks, about the relationships, about understanding the complex adaptive system which a society is. You know, in New Zealand, doing a lot of work there, reforming their way they train all their emergency leaders into being people who manage networks and think about levels of uncertainty and about being curious. So curiosity is now a major trait of a good emergency manager. And they're good at asking questions. They're good at saying, I don't understand how society works. None of us understand how the society works. It's extremely complex. So when in New Zealand they decided to close butcher shops as part of COVID, that meant thousands of pigs had to be slaughtered, which took income away from farmers and had all these cascading problems because the people making decisions weren't talking to each other. And this is a challenge for us. Managing low frequency, high consequence events probably means working with people we don't work with in routine events. And unfortunately, emergency management systems struggle in many places talking or linking to people that aren't part of the normal group. And that's a challenge for us going forward.
Thanks, David. And I'll go to Kirsten because of your particular experience in local government.
Oh, look, I would just, back up what David and Helen have said, and particularly, the environmental scan, and often weird and wonderful things come out that might be of significance to the community, but you just think, oh, where did that come from? And I guess one of the examples that I've come across before that really got me asking some questions was a community that lives nowhere near an airport, why they were so concerned a plane was going to fall out of the sky. So, just things like that, and continuing the conversation.
Thanks, Kirsten. Now we're going to go to a sort of a slightly different question here, but how does the handbook account for or integrate the technological advancements that we're seeing in emergency planning? So I'm aware now that a lot of emergency plans include, links to, data schemas and all sorts of things like that, electronic plans of buildings and so on. So David, sounds like you've got a bit of experience here. I might go to you first.
Well, not saying I've got a bit of experience, but what we're certainly, as you say, we're seeing a situation where the technology being used today, whether it be virtual operations teams to sift through the huge amount of information on social media, use of drones, and now those sorts of things in the space. Live information. We looked at Superstorm Sandy, where they could tell who was in the houses because of who could flush toilets, because the electronic water meters would tell them that. So part of a challenge, I think, for the emergency management community is getting to understand what data and what systems are out there sucking data in every minute of every day. Your phone's living data into some system somewhere, but we've not really worked out, and privacy is part of the problem. Part of the problem is that a lot of that data is held by private business, and government and private business find it hard to talk together on some of these issues. There's lots of work to be done, lots of work trying to be done in that space. If you went to the US, many places now have the community EOC with their business EOC co-located, so that businesses in the room next door to the government agencies. It's a challenge for us, and it's a challenge because what we know is that the human brain finds it hard processing large amounts of data. Certainly using AI, we can do part of that, but there's a lot of work done in that space, I think, before we actually master that.
And
so
Helen,
no real easy answer there.
Did you want to talk about how you've used technology?
Yeah, so from the aspect of providing data, the Bureau of Meteorology provides a lot of, and that's my current employer, provides a lot of data to emergency services. And in fact, we partner with emergency services in most states and territories, and we share common workspace with respect to emergencies in their EOCs. That is just one amount of data and one important part of the data that you need when you're doing your planning and when you're managing emergencies. It's the fact that you have that agreement in place and you have the capacity to draw in those experts when you need them. And the point is you develop those relationships prior to the emergency. So when it all goes to custard, that then you've got the right people in the room that can help you with that data and enable that technology to work for you. And it should already be set up if you've partnered correctly with them.
Thanks,
Helen. I think part of the challenge there is that a lot of the data will be publicly available to people. They can see what's happening. And I think a challenge I'm seeing mentioned that lots of workshops are run is by the emergency management community saying, but we need factual data. Well, the community's already made decisions before you get your factual data based on open source data. And that's a challenge.
That's true.
Okay, look, we've got time for one more question. I am getting the wind up from the AIDR team. So I'll go to you, Kirsten. Involving children and young people in emergency planning, can you comment on your experience in that area?
So it wasn't the work that was undertaken by me. It was undertaken by the team at Macedon before I joined. But I guess it was driven by a community member and the team at Macedon. And I think that community member was also an employee of Save the Children Australia. So there's a handbook available through the Department of Health and Human Services. And what the practical output of that for the MEMC, or the Municipal Emergency Management Planning Committee, was they have a male and a female high school student who actually sit on the committee. So
they get children in the planning.
Yeah, that's right.
David, did you want to comment?
In New Zealand, I do a lot of work over there, and that's becoming more and more the norm, that the planning groups and in their EOCs, they'll have representatives from the Maori community, from the Pacific community, representing young people, representing disabled people. So the people making decisions who don't experience those lives can actually have on tap people who understand that sector of the community. And that's great to hear, Kirsten.
Okay, so just a very quick one, and then we better wrap up the Q&A. David, you may know this. EMA have recently released the Crisis Appreciation Strategic Planning Guidebook. Are you aware of that document?
No.
No,
but I'll go and Google it now.
Yes, well, that's right. So someone wanted to know the link between that and the planning handbook, but I think that we might take that question on notice. And when we go out with the information that this webinar is now online, we can provide a bit more background on that. So look, I'd like to thank you all for taking part in the Q&A and getting through so many questions, and for being available to speak today on the webinar. We've really been grateful for that. So in closing, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. I think we had close to 300 participants online at one point, and I'd like to thank our guest speakers for showcasing the new handbook and sharing their knowledge, experience and their time. The next handbook that AIDR will be showcasing is the Flood Emergency Planning Handbook. We will host a webinar to launch that in mid-November. The timing for this webinar, for those of you who are interested, is because it's actually WorkSafe Month. And we know that emergency planning is a key mitigation strategy for all things to do with risk in a workplace context. So that's why this was timed for October. We'll be sending you a link of recording of today's webinar for those who attended or for those who registered but were unable to attend. And I also encourage you to explore the Australian Disaster Resilience Handbook collection on the Knowledge Hub, which is where the webinar recording will be hosted along with a suite of other resources. So thank you very much for joining us today and good afternoon.